Hello friends, I hope I find you all well. My name is Wilma and this is my channel MB Reads. And today we're going to talk about all the books I read in March 2024 / late February because I didn't do a February wrap up. So let's roll. So I've got all my computer notes with all the notes and stuff that I've made on all the books. These books are the books that I read for a video that was reading Books to Grammar's favorite books of 2023. It's a long one, but they have timestamps in it, and if you want to hear my thoughts on any of these books, these are the ones I read in that video, which was the majority of February. Then these books are the books that I will be, physical books that I'll be talking about in this video. Here are some comics that I read in late February and March. So I thought I would just start with the comics. Again, all the timestamps are down below if you want to hear about like a specific book or skip the comic section, that's also okay. The first book I'll talk about in this video is Goth by Kate Leth. This follows this like goth girl who has had to like change schools, move towns because she kind of got bullied by her old friend group a little bit because she was LGBT. What is that video? LGBTQI. Yeah. So what I thought this book was about was that it was about this goth girl who spent so much time at the mall and then developed a crush on like a girl that works at the mall. Why did I think that was what the book was about? I don't know. It's not about that. I was like disappointed by this book because I had completely different expectations of it, which is 100% my fault. There's nothing wrong with this comic book. It's flowed very smoothly, like the style, the characters, everything felt like good and fleshed out. The art style is just fine. I didn't have any qualms about it or specific thoughts about it, to be honest. When I was reading this, had just watched Sunny's Book Nook video about lesbian fiction that talked about like sapphic representation, what it looks like, why it is so like bisexual heavy, or why it's often like femme for femme instead of like femme for butch or butch for butch stories that are being told and are the most popular. So I had like that video in the back of my mind when I was reading this because they kind of coincided at the same time. So when I was reading this, and our main character is bisexual, and this is not a video for bi erasure, we're not gonna go down the biphobia path, but I just had different expectations. And even though it's told in the story that she's bisexual, this whole story is about her relationship with two men in her life. One of them is predatory, which is like kind of trigger warning for that. And she also doesn't really have any like crushes on girls in this book. So we're like being told about her representation, but we're not seeing it. Obviously that does not mean she's not bisexual, but it's just not the type of story that I wanted. So I gave it 3 stars, but like if it wasn't in comic format, I definitely would have like rated it lower. And then I read this comic for the trans... me blanking. Trans readathon? What was it? Trans rights readathon. I cannot believe I forgot that. Moth and Whisper, a long time ago, I got recommended this book by Sage, who made a very old video about like non-binary and trans book recommendations. I had this on my TBR for such a long time. This is like a sci-fi futuristic world where there's a myth about a moth and a whisperer who kind of were like these unknowable characters who did all these like spying for rivals and stuff like that. And we're following a main character who's the child of the moth and the whisperer, and they're able to like change their body, which is like the non-binary dream, am I right? And presentation and stuff. But their parents have gone missing and they go in search for their parents who've gone missing. I really liked the premise of this book. I thought the world building was really cool, although brief, and I would have liked to understand the world more. I liked how the character like approached the conflict of the situation. I wish that it was tempoed differently, specifically like the last scene in this book where like all the conflict is kind of like resolved happened so quickly, and it's kind of unbelievable that it would, to be honest, which like bugged me. It's volume 1 and set up to be kind of like a series, but I think this is all it is and is ever going to be. I gave it 4 stars, but I just wish I would have loved it more because it's just like the exact type of premise that I really love. Yeah. Then I picked up a manga. This is Coyote Volume 2 by Ranmaru Saria. So this is a gay smut manga. There is a word for it. This is the second one. I read the first one when I wasn't really filming booktube videos. You haven't heard me talk about it, I think. It follows this guy who's like a werewolf, and he falls in love with this son of a mafia gang who's like hunting werewolves. So it's like a forbidden love story type of thing. I like this one a lot more. I think I gave it 4 stars. I enjoyed it a lot. What I like about this one is it's not all about the smut. Like the story is really good and it always leaves you like hanging and wanting more. And I felt like in the first one it was a lot of information and info dumpy, but I got like a way better grasp on the story and the characters in this book, which I really loved. And it had like such a cliffhanger at the end. And I really can't wait to pick up the next one. My biggest con with this book, and it's a big one because it ranked it down like a whole star. It could have been a 5-star. But the fact that it's kind of like playing off of consent, breaking consent in a way that I don't like reading about because it is never addressed. So how the sex scenes play out in this series, which is like, it's always the same, is that Coyote, our main character werewolf, is just like shocked every time Marlene makes like a sex move on him. It's just like, no, what are you doing? I don't understand. What's going on? Well, like as if he's like never had sex with him before and like they don't do it regularly. And then he always tells like Marlene, the other main character, to like stop, like don't do it. You're going too hard. Like stop. I don't want this. But it's like he does. And so what they're like doing is kind of like non-consent kink. I think it has a word for it, which is like fine if that's a thing that you want and have expressed, but like because it is not addressed, it just feels like it's non-consensual, which it is obviously not, but it's just like, I don't like that vibe. You know, it's just not good vibes. Yeah. And the last comic I want to talk about is Press Enter to Continue by Ana Galvan. This is translated from Spanish. I believe this is her first book. I read her second book, which is one complete novel. This is a short story collection of comics. I really enjoyed it. I don't remember what that book was called, but something about Mr. Burger, yeah. I'll put that one here. I really enjoyed this one, but I enjoy this one even more. They're kind of this like speculative sci-fi short stories that explores like different small sci-fi elements. It's very reminiscent of like speculative sci-fi short story collections in just like written form, but they're done in such a beautiful graphic novel style. Like her style is just really unique and cool. I just like it a lot. Yeah, just really amazing. This book is super unique. I think the way the author used like colors and shapes and the illustration to tell the story, and the story is told like it's like symbiosis that just like develops so beautifully. Like the way the story is told is amazing. It's also very quiet. There's not a lot of dialogue, and so the images say a lot. And I think Anna gives like a lot of room for the reader to interpret the story and the world, and also with the ending. I just think it's really great how they're all kind of like open-ended, but you also get enough to find it enjoyable, which I think is a really hard balance. And the fact that it's done in comic form and that it's such a cool, unique style and experience is just amazing. I gave this 5 stars. Now let's get into the books I read physically. Let's start with the 3 books that I read at the end of February. The first one is Query by Sila Novikov. This is also published by T-Round Press and is like a tiny little book, which I love. This whole book is written in letters two publishers and editors from Scylla, our author and main character, trying to sell her book. So it's just written in those emails, and it's really effective because Scylla starts to get like really frustrated with not getting responses or feedback, and also being really catty with the type of emails she's sending. So she starts changing her address to like really funny things. She starts like changing the plot of the book, the genre of the book, and starts comparing it to other books that are just like so random and different in every single email. Like she just wants to have someone respond to her. They just turn like more and more personal, so you get, and more like silly, I guess. And you just get more and more excerpts of Scylla's own life. Like she starts using these emails as like a diary entry in a way, which I thought was like a fun way to slowly feel like we're getting more and more from Scylla's own life. Because in the beginning, you're essentially reading kind of like the same letter over and over again, like for a couple of pages. So it's a very quick read and it's very short, but I just thought that it was really good. I think that the balance between like little silly elements and the more important context of like what she's trying to gain here, like she's trying to sell herself and she's trying to sell her work using her personal background as like being like climate activist and what she's experienced to like sell her book, which is, I don't even know, it could be anything at this point. I just thought it was really well done. I think that because this is written from like this white, fairly privileged woman's background, it doesn't quite have the punch that a book like this could have. But because it's Scylla as like the author and also the main character, it's like, what else is she supposed to write about? But I do think it kind of limited how impactful the book could have been. And it does definitely like address like her privilege with the way that people in her life are like responding to some of her like ignorance and stuff. If you share like Scylla's experience, like it could be very relatable in many ways. But I think because of the main character, it just doesn't have as much impact as it could have, because I do think the themes that this explores, like with commodifying the self and trying to fit into like a capitalist world and selling your work and stuff, are like important topics, and where do you fit into like the revolution and stuff like that. But it just doesn't really go there, and I think a lot of the similar topics are discussed in The Fifth Wound when Aurora is talking about also like selling her work to publishers and stuff like that. But I enjoyed it a lot. It was a good read. Next up, I picked up You Exist Too Much by Saina Arafat. So I've heard a lot of things about this lately, and I want to pick it up because I also heard that it was queer and it's a Palestinian American author. So you follow our main character who just moved in with her girlfriend in an apartment, but she struggles with committing to a relationship and like fully loving someone, and she just keeps cheating and having these like random love affairs that don't really mean anything to her, but it's like a compulsive, addictive need. And then when they break up, she realizes this thing about herself, and she goes to seek help for her like love addiction, which she's just like read about on the internet. This is just like unlikable main character storylines. But what I think that it does really well, it's like it weaves in her relationship to her homeland, Palestine, with her relationship to her mother, which is just very flawed and wounded, and how she relates this to like people in her life, like the feeling of love, of needing that love like that she never really feel like she got from her mother, and not feeling like she belongs when she like goes back home. And also like the economic status of her two parents. Like it just explores like a lot of different things that are packed into this and told through this story, which I think is like really well done. Like I feel like the author just like succeeded in that. I just have a really difficult time following characters that just make bad choices. Like I just feel like I'm screaming at the page, and I do think it's like well written because it makes me feel that way. But it's also just like not really enjoyable for me, which is not a critique of the book, it's just my personal opinion. With that being said, I feel like I found the main character's story and process of working through her emotions very realistic. It wasn't like, oh, she got therapy, she got help, now everything's better. Like everything felt natural and organic. Although I will say that the the narration voice of this story seemed a lot more intelligent and self-aware than the main character seemed, which I thought was a little odd. Like, it was a little bit of a mismatch for me in my brain to like connect those two, even though it was written in first person. And the last thing I will say about this book is Roxanne blurbed it and said deeply compelling and sexy. And when I read this, I'm like, sexy. The whole time, like, yeah, she's having sex with women, and some might see that as hot, but her whole thing is like cheating, which to me is like fundamentally not sexy. So I do not understand why this book is sexy. Also, it deals with like trauma and like emotions a lot, and I'm just like, also not a super sexy subject in the context of this book. Weird blurb, Roxane gave. And a very similar book that I picked up next is Ponyboy by Elliot Duncan. This also deals with like addiction, love, just very similar like themes and main characters. The way they're also very unlikable and like the way the story progresses, so similar. Like, I just can't believe I read these two books after each other. This is a fairly new release, debut, I believe, kind of autofiction. You follow a main character, Ponyboy, who is kind of pre-transition, pre-coming out as a trans man. He lives with his girlfriend in Paris, and his girlfriend is like lesbian and do not date men, and is just like very in denial about how Ponyboy is a trans man. And she and their relationship just frustrated me a lot. She also introduced like drugs into his life pretty much, and it just like takes off from there. He's like struggled with love addiction. That was the previous book. Struggled with drug addiction, and you're just following him as he just like plummets. And it's so difficult to read because you're just turning the pages waiting for like, oh my God, when is he gonna like die? Or like, it's just difficult to read that way. So like, huge trigger warning for that, because that's like the majority of the book. I really enjoyed the trans perspectives and thoughts on gender and his life when it came to transness. Like, I just thought that was really good and very, very relatable. Like, that was just like my favorite part of this book. It didn't feel contrived. It felt natural, but also in like a relatable way. And that was really well done. I liked that a lot. And I also liked his relationship with his childhood friend, Tony, who was also trans, and I wanted more of that, maybe. But maybe that's just because I'm very T for T. I felt like maybe I wanted a little bit more from the ending, but I think I just like this book. I only rated it like slightly higher than this one just because they're so similar. Like, I just can't believe I read these after each other. Also, just like with how the story progresses and the narrative, and yeah. But I think I like this one a little more just because of the language maybe, or the type of like conclusions and reflections he came to. It was a little pretentious at times in the writing maybe, but I also didn't mind it. Yeah, it's just weird. But I think I gave these this one 3.75 and this one 3.5 stars. And then we move into March. First in March, I picked up Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata. This is a short story collection. I have read her other two books, Convenience Store Woman and Earthlings, as well. And this kind of felt like a mashup of those two, taking some of the more like speculative cannibalist elements of Earthlings together with the more mundane setting of Convenience Store Woman. Loved Earthlings. Hated Convenience Store Woman. Sorry about that. So this was kind of just like in the middle of the road. I didn't plan to pick this up. I was at the hospital, or the animal hospital, with Charm, who has unfortunately passed, and I had to wait for hours for like him to do some like scan and testing. I hadn't brought a book with me, so I just went into the closest bookstore and got this one. And it was just like these type of stories with what was currently going on in my life just did not work, which made me enjoy this also like way less. The main story in this Life Ceremony is kind of like about when a person dies, you eat them at their funeral, and it's supposed to be seen as a beautiful thing, and then couples go off and copulate. I'm getting a little bit tired of this more bland and simple trend in East Asian fiction. I think mostly in Japanese fiction. It's just not for me. And I think I'm going to take a longer break from reading it. I think the premise of the stories are more interesting than the execution and how they're written. A lot of the stories explore like food, where that fits into like society and your mind, and also kind of talks about like relationships, and the whole book is kind of very averse to sex, and none of the main characters engage or like sex in any way, which I find interesting. But this was just not for me. One of the stories that was about this woman who like started to see the city as like living and like organs and stuff made me nauseous. Like it made me actually physically nauseous, which I don't really know why. Yeah, I don't really want to talk about this book anymore, to be honest. Then I read a hit. This is The Call Out by Kat Fitzpatrick. This is a novel written in rhyme, in verse, which is really cool. You follow these 6 trans lesbian women and 1 cis lesbian woman as they exist in this trans lesbian community in Brooklyn. And it's about like their drama interpersonally and communally, the shenanigans that they get up to and how each of the relationships kind of like work or don't work and what breaks them apart. It is also about this thing that happens that causes someone to be like called out for their behavior. And it happens very far into the book, which I didn't necessarily mind, even though that the book is named after that, because it takes a while for, at least for me, to like grasp all the characters, because it's all like written in rhyme and you're following so many characters. I'm extremely impressed like by what the book did. Because it's written in rhyme, it creates like so many funny rhymes that had me giggle. And I listened to the podcast episode of Gender Reveal where they interview the author Kat Fitzpatrick also about this book. And it was so weird because I was reading this book, I just clicked on Gender Reveal and my phone automatically scrolls down to the episode with Kat Fitzpatrick. And this was like a long time ago, and I had not listened to the episodes before or after on this podcast. It just like popped up like on my screen, that one. It was so odd and bizarre, and I was like, what is going on? But then naturally, I listened to that podcast when I was like halfway through this book, which is kind of like the perfect point to listen to that podcast episode, to be honest. But I recommend it if you want to read this book to also hear some of Kat's thoughts. But this was just phenomenal. I'm so impressed. The way it kind of mashes up like atmosphere and characters and the dialogue, which is also written in rhyme, and you know like people don't talk in rhyme, but they do in this book, together with like the really important conversations. Like I just think it was really great. It felt fun and brief, but also interesting and made me think about a lot of stuff. Our main character is kind of this like person who's outside of the drama a little bit, but also not. And I thought that was very well done because she also had some like interesting points of views and like ways of observing the situation, or ways of like writing about all these characters in her community. But I just thought it was excellent. I gave it 4.75 stars. Just very trans lesbian drama, done excellently. Highly recommend. And then what happened is that I discovered Itch.io because I messaged the author Mars Adler, which writes like erotica / smut, sci-fi, horror, trans, smut, horror, sci-fi, erotica. They pointed me towards that their books are like available on Itch.io, and then I got into Itch.io deep dive and read a lot of the different small stuff that I won't really talk about. But I read this one, First Creation, which is one of their books. This is about a fallen angel and angel who's on Earth. They're both wounded, and we know that something happened up in heaven to cause them to both be on Earth, and they have this like sexual tension that they're working through, and it's very conflicted as to whether it's ethical for them to have this sexual tension, kind of. It's short, it's like under 100 pages, and I enjoyed it. I'm not super intrigued by the premise and contents of like angel and demons and fallen and like the discussion of religion within that. I also didn't quite believe them as fully rounded characters, but I think that's also because it's very brief and the author's like trying to do like world building, like sexual tension, relationship history, world building. I already said that. all in like under 100 pages, which I think is very difficult. And I do think that author like Mars found like a fairly good balance of how to do all those things. But I think it could have been better for it to be a little bit longer. And I do think that the timeline of the story, if it was told like chronologically, wouldn't be interesting at all. But because it kind of jumped from like past to present, it worked much better for me, and I thought that was well done. I also thought it was like a little cheesy at times, like the writing. Sometimes, like for example, it would use the phrase, like, the air smelled like fear or something like that twice, which is just one of those lines that, what does that even smell like? What is that, you know? And it was used twice, which is just an example of like how the writing is in many ways. I was also a little confused by this book because I don't really know the difference between erotica and smut. And this is not an official definition because I haven't read that much, but I feel like the difference between like erotica and smut is that smut is just like it's just a lot of sex, and erotica is more about the tension, the sexual tension, and like what drives the plot forward. And I felt like this book is driven by the erotic feelings of the characters rather than being just pumped with sex scenes, which it's not. It has just like one on-page sex scene, which was a new thing that I learned. But yeah, a lot of trigger warnings for this one, surprisingly. It's like cannibalism, religious trauma. Look it up. Next up, I read The Archive of Alternative Endings by Lindsay Drager. I found this one on Storygraph and I was just like, this sounds exactly like a book that I would really love. How do I explain this book? It's a kaleidoscopic story following stories from, let me see, all these years up here, spans many, many years. And it tells like a narrative or story from all these years, but it jumps in different time. It jumps through these stories of time in different themes of the different chapters. And it uses the tale of Hansel and Gretel to tell that story. And also it connects the story of Hansel and Gretel to the Halley's Comet. And I thought that sounded exciting, and also with all these different perspectives and timelines. And a large like theme and focus of the book is that all the characters are connected to gayness, lesbianism in some way, and connects like the original story of Hansel and Gretel to that. I thought it was really interesting. I liked the interpretation of Hansel and Gretel and how it evolves through times, how like stories evolve through time, and how stories affect us as humans, and how it also tells the story of like us. There was just a lot of good things about this book and a lot of elements that it's just like a recipe for a book that I would really love. And therefore, I felt like I should have enjoyed this book more. Like, I don't feel like the book quite had like the impact that it could have. And the longer I was away from the book, the less spectacular the book seemed, which is just like never a good sign. Because I just like tend to love stories like this, like with also like My Volcano, like how there's many different narratives through many different periods of time, and they kind of just like weave together and tell like a bigger story. Like, I love that shit. I eat it up. I just felt like there was like a slight gap between what the book was trying to do and then what I received from the book that made me feel like, well, what was the point of the whole book? Like, if you're gonna have like this whole expansive thing, like I got the themes of like siblinghood, of queerness, of storytelling, of like collectiveness, but the emotions that I was supposed to be left with didn't quite land in me when I finished the book, which made me feel like the book was quite cynical in many ways and like dark rather than give me all that much, which I guess is like my main critique of this story. But I love reading stories like this, like unique. Some is like, it's very short and sometimes it's written in like binary code. Just gosh, I just wanted more. And that's why I think it hurts even more. And I picked up a classic. Excellent. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. My second James Baldwin. So this follows David. He lives in Paris. Paris books. Theme of the month. No, I read Ponyboy last month, didn't I? He's proposed to his future fiance, and she's like, I'm gonna go to Spain and think about it. And so he's left in Paris all alone and starts up this affair with Giovanni that works at a bar. This book is also just like unlikable characters. Our main character is also just David. He makes so many bad choices. And it's like the whole book is like he's lying to his future fiance. He's lying to himself. He's lying to Giovanni. It's just no part in this book he's being honest with anyone about anything in his life. Like, he's just so lost. It's obviously, it takes place in the past because it's written, when are you written? Oh, first published 1956. So I guess it takes place in 1956. And so he just like doesn't really want to be gay/bi. He doesn't even admit to himself that he might be queer. It's just everyone in this story, their gayness is more like insinuated, but also very evident. But okay, enough of the plot. I loved the writing in this. I thought the writing was really good. And it's actually kind of fun to read a classic that's not really problematic. Like, I feel like I used to read much more classics and I enjoyed them a lot from time to time. Sometimes I really enjoy like older writing, and I think it was fun to kind of like return to that in a way and read something that wasn't full of horrible views or like misogyny everywhere. I will say though that some parts I'm like, is this misogyny? Like the way that our main character, yes, David, for sure. But then when his fiance was talking, she had, I felt like, quite a good balance to David's misogyny. And I ended up really liking it. I gave it 4.25 stars. I'm super glad I read it. It's fun to have some gay classics in my repertoire that I can recommend. And I'm excited to have read more James Baldwin. Before I say goodbye to this book, I just want to mention, it's really sad. The ending is really sad. It's just kind of depressing. TBH. Next up, I read Little Blue Encyclopedia for Vivian by Hazel J. Plante. I read Any Other City by her last year. I really loved it, and I loved this one even more. New favorites. In my notes, I literally wrote, this book was literally everything. I love books featuring queer grief. It's true. I love books featuring queer grief. Also with the book And Then the Grey Heaven, also with like queer grief themes. It's just something that really resonates with me, being queer and also having a lot of grief. This book, you're following our main character who is a trans lesbian woman, and her best friend who is trans and straight has died. Her name is Vivian, and this book is a encyclopedia about Little Blue, which is Vivian's favorite TV show, and tells the story of Vivian's life from the perspective of our main character through the show of The Little Blue. And The Little Blue is like a fictional show that we get to learn a lot about, like all the characters from the story and how Vivian like related her own experience to it, or how our main character thinks that Vivian related her own lived experience through the characters of The Little Blue. And something I've also learned about myself through something my partner said about me was like, you really like lore, don't you? And I was like, yeah, I do. I love Easter eggs. I love lore. I love getting really obsessed with a fandom and just like digging in and like finding out a lot of different stuff, which I think is a reason why I like books like this that kind of do explore the lore of this fictional TV show Little Blue, the actors, how the show came to be, like little Easter eggs and like how they connect and stuff. Like that's just part of the show, which is not part of the plot, but I just enjoy reading that as well, on top of just this being so good, like how the story progresses with what we learn about Vivian and our main character and their relationship, and like the ending. Oh my god, the ending, like I wasn't prepared. I was like, fine, this book is good. I'm really enjoying it with all like the music references and the characters. Everything just feels like natural and organic, and really true to real life and the author. And then the last chapter happened and it broke me. I was crying and crying, and I just like, it was just really good. And when a book makes me cry like that on the last page, I'm like 5 stars. Instant 5 stars. I really am enjoying this style that Hazel Jane Plante does of like the main character in the book is writing the book. She does it really well. I cannot wait for whatever she's gonna write next. Oh yeah, and I read this for the Trans Rights Readathon. And the other book that I read for the Trans Rights Readathon was Depart by Sim Kern. I should have read Sim Kern's books a long time ago, because if you've been around, you know that we did the climate fiction book club. Like, I'm blanking on the name. With Sim and Sage. I didn't want to read Sim's books during that time when we were doing the live shows and stuff, because I didn't want like my perception of them to be like altered by the books, or like what if I like didn't like the books, you know? Like, it was just, I don't know, it was all in my head about it. But now I was like, well, this would be fun because Sim created the Trans Rights Readathon, and I have been wanting to pick up their books. So I was really excited that I got to this, and it was a huge hit. I gave it 5 stars. I have very little, if no critique of this book. I think what it tried to do, it did flawlessly. You follow Noah, who is caught in the middle of climate disaster in Texas. He flees because he has to, and ends up at this shelter where he has to stay with like all these different people who all need shelter during the flood. And it's just so many walks of life and the conflict that happens there, but also his grief over the life and the people he's had to leave behind because of this. It's all very immediate, and Noah's trying to like process what he's going through. And on top of that, he's kind of seeing visions of his, I want to say great-grandfather, who managed to, or grandfather, I don't know which one, who managed to escape the Holocaust as a child. It has to be grandfather, right? Who escaped the Holocaust as a child, and he's appearing as a ghost to Noah, giving him like premonitions of what's gonna happen, trying to save him. And Noah's like freaked out by all of this, doesn't know what it means, but the ghost has saved his life. The book is a lot about like his Jewishness, how he views it for himself, and how he applies the lived experience of generations before him to what is going on with the climate crisis and the situation he is in right now, and the choices he decides to make because of that. It's just really well done. It's well written. It's kind of a page turner. Doesn't have any chapters, which serves like a short book like this well. The way this shelter setting explored like how homophobia and transphobia and racism all get heightened in a setting of crisis, and how the police response, police brutality is in there. So it has like a lot of trigger warnings, so it's just like a lot to process, but it's just really well done. And I like the exploration of like queerness through Jewish history that the main character discovers. I liked how the Noah like learned from his mistakes, and the arc of this was just really good. The ending was good. It's just really good. Highly recommend. I cannot wait to read Free People's Village by Sim Kern as well, which I cannot get my hands on. And I think it's sold out of print most places. And then I read, we're so soon done, people. One more book to talk about. I read an arc of the book Schizotopia. I recently opened my NetGalley account again. This book is by Andy Siege. It is a confusing premise to talk about. You follow this main character who is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and has just come out of like a mental health facility. His girlfriend goes missing, which takes him on a journey throughout the city looking for her, which is a very it's not really the premise of the book, but I can't tell you what the actual premise of the book because it would be like a spoiler. The book essentially explores how mental illness and a diagnosis like paranoid schizophrenia can connect with transness and queerness, how they work together. And I do think that it could have done that better. But I also have kind of like a lot of respect for what this book did. I gave it 2 stars, which I think is a little bit unfair for this book. There were times when I was like having a lot of fun with the book because it gets really bizarre. Like our main character thinks that there's like lizard people and that he's an agent who is trying to uncover who lizard people are. And at times he thinks he's homeless. it jumps through like different realities that the main character is experiencing. And I think the paranoid schizophrenia, the diagnosis, is explored very well in this book. And I think the author probably has the diagnosis because I think it is quite true to what it is like. And I talked to my schizophrenic friend about this book, and they were like, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, you know? So I think if you don't have this diagnosis and you don't know enough about it, it can seem quite extreme, but paranoid schizophrenia can also be quite extreme depending on who the person is, you know? So I thought that was well done. What I didn't like about this book necessarily is the way it described and diagnosed other people in the book with kind of like wrongful diagnoses and kind of out of date names for different disorders and diagnoses. And they weren't really correct or like well represented, I believe, and that kind of like rubbed me the wrong way. But I do have like I try to like suspend my judgment a little bit because the author comes from like a part of the world that like I don't, and the diagnoses they use there and the definitions of diagnoses they use there might be different from like Western world, you know? But at the end of the day, like I gave it 2 stars, which now I'm like, maybe I should have given it at least 3 stars because I did have kind of like a fun time reading it. And I do think that the themes that it tries to explore is just kind of interesting and something I want to learn more about. Oh, 2 cons to this book also. The way it talks about like fatness and just like general fat phobia in this book, not good. Yeah, I didn't like that part at all. There's a part where our main character is like commenting on someone else taking antidepressants and it making them gain weight, and he was all like, I'm so lucky that's not me, which is just like, come on. And then also I think the trans woman side character in this was kind of stereotyped, which is like, stereotypes exist, I know, but like I feel like that could have been a more complex character because she was quite flat to me. So parts like that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I think that rubbing of the wrong way is what made me bump it so low. So thank you all for watching this video. Comment down below if you read any of these, your thoughts on them, any books that you read and loved in March. And then that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a brilliant, amazing day, and I will chat with all of you soon. Bye!